Thank you for watching another episode of Football Insiders. Jason Andera, Michael McCleary from Argus Leader Media, talking football. And we had a pretty interesting week last week that we want to get into right away. AAA has been fascinating with the ups and downs. There are a couple of teams that the trend is definitely going north, and the one we want to talk about to start with here is Lincoln. Lincoln's a team that's won. They lost to Brandon Valley a couple weeks ago, came back strong against Jefferson last week. Going into the year, this is the one team I thought was maybe outside the top contenders list. They have really made themselves known as a contender.
Yeah, for sure. And this is the hardest part of their schedule too, and they're really fighting through it. I mean, they got through that first part of the schedule, and we probably thought coming into the year that was going to be the easy part of their schedule, but then Stevens looked a little bit better than maybe we expected, and a lot of those teams in the front. I mean, obviously Watertown gave them trouble too, and Watertown's a pretty good AA team. So I mean, they got through some of the hardships of the season, but that now they're sort of hitting their stride. We know that they're a really good defense, but their offense is coming along, and they look like they're going to be a force.
Yeah, they had a good game. Gabe Gutierrez had a nice game running the ball, getting close to 100 yards. Smith got them another 100-yard receiving performance. Tate Schaefer, just a sophomore quarterback, he looks like he's starting to turn the page as far as managing games, protecting the ball a little bit better. He did have a turnover again, but all in all, they controlled that game against Jefferson, and that also says something about Jefferson the last couple of weeks. We knew that depth would be an issue. Teams have figured out a little bit how to contain Talon Ashley. He's still getting his big yards, but they're not getting as many big plays per game. Are you worried if you're Jefferson at all with a couple losses in a row?
These past two teams in a row, I think, are sort of the anti-Jefferson. Jefferson is sort of that big play team that almost sort of, counts on just the chaos to make their offense go. Lincoln and Roosevelt, they control possession. They're really steady teams on the offensive end. So, they're not going to really allow Jefferson many chances. I mean, we saw in that Roosevelt game a couple weeks ago. I mean, Talon Ashley made some of the best plays at the quarterback spot that there has been all season long, and they lost by, almost 3 touchdowns. Yeah. So, it's tough. Jefferson just has so much talent, so it's hard to bet against them. Griffin Wilde is maybe the best wide receiver in AAA.
He had another big week last week against Lincoln.
So, yeah, I mean, it's really hard to count Jefferson out, but the last 2 weeks hasn't necessarily been, a very pleasant look towards their playoff future, because there's going to be a lot of teams that are playing their best football come playoff time. So if they know how to beat Jefferson, then Jefferson's going to have a tough time.
Well, Jefferson, we'll talk about their game coming up this week against number 1 Harrisburg. But before I do that, we got to throw out some props to Roosevelt as well as the game that they played last week against Washington. It was close throughout the first 3 quarters, and once again, Roosevelt lays the smackdown in the 4th quarter, and they've been doing it by running the football. Yeah, and
head coach Kim Nelson said after the game, they got lucky a few times. Nelson was saying that they didn't really necessarily come into this game with as much excitement as they probably should have. I mean, Washington's a good team, and Kim was excited for this game, but he didn't feel like his team was. But then after that fumble that Nelson Wright recovered on a punt return and just kind of returned it for a touchdown. He didn't even know he had it in his hands when he recovered it. That touchdown sort of livened the sideline, and they started to get a little bit of offense going. And then, when Asmar Muhammad returned that interception for a touchdown, that was kind of all she wrote. So, that was a good performance for Roosevelt. They got lucky, but that's sort of what good teams get themselves in the position to do. They've proven over the last 2 weeks that they're a team that belongs up there.
Speaking of a sophomore quarterback, they got it done once again with Jackson Brower, just managing the team down the field, not making big mistakes. And then Nelson Wright's 4th game in a row now over 100 yards. They've gotten great help between that duo at running back with Tyree Nave and Nelson Wright. So we'll talk about Roosevelt's game coming up this week in just a minute against Lincoln. But let's get into this week's games. Let's going to start with Jefferson at Harrisburg. Harrisburg's now played 2 weeks in a row where they haven't had to bite their nails into the 4th quarter. Are they going to have to bite their nails in this game?
You never know. I mean, Jefferson can put up points on the board really quickly. So, there's a chance that sort of how it developed in the last couple games where Harrisburg was struggling a little bit, Jefferson can come out really quick. They could potentially go up 14-0 if they get a stop and, on their first 2 drives, get a touchdown. I mean, that could happen in 2 plays for Jefferson.
Right. And Harrisburg is not known for early starts. They have not started strong, even against some of these games last couple weeks.
No, and Jacob Knuth, he does this sort of thing with his cadence where he claps a few times before it actually snaps. And, you see in the beginning of some of Harrisburg's games, he almost fools his own linemen. So it takes them a while to settle into that. And, they really, Harrisburg really probably needs to clean some things up as they hit playoff time. But, talent prevails. It has prevailed for them all season. So, I would still go with Harrisburg in a game like this, but, Jefferson's going to give them problems.
I think I would take a page out of the playbook the last couple weeks against Jefferson and go big time to Gavin Ross. I think he's going to have a big game against Jefferson. I also think that Knuth can make some big plays. They get Andrew Walter back this week. Carter Barenfuss is back this week. I think Harrisburg would really like to let the rest of the state know that they are the #1 team. And I could see them winning by a couple scores if they get their offensive line right in this one, playing at home against Jefferson. Lincoln taking on Roosevelt. This has quickly become a very interesting battle. 2 teams, like you said, that like to control the ball. Lincoln does it with Angel Jershegi. Roosevelt does it with the pair of running backs. Is this thing a low-scoring game or a high-scoring game? I can't tell because both like to run, but both put up points in bunches as well.
Yeah, I think the Roosevelt-Washington game was actually a good sort of, comparison to what this game could be because, Washington is a similar team, likes to establish the run, likes to keep the ball, and, Roosevelt sort of ran away with it, and obviously, like we said before, it took some defensive plays to get there. But, both these teams have, pretty good defenses. I would say that Lincoln's probably a little bit cleaner of a defense, whereas Roosevelt just has that big playability. But, I would expect, sort of a similar score, at least in terms of, the point total that we had in that Roosevelt-Washington. Just because it's 2 good defenses doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be low scoring.
I could not agree with you more. This will be a lot of fun to see how these 2 sophomore quarterbacks go at it. It's interesting, the coaches put out their poll. They have Roosevelt ranked at #3, and that tells you what the coaches think about Roosevelt right now is they're trending definitely upward, and Lincoln has been steady all season long. That will be a very interesting game. 6 o'clock start at Howard Wood Field. Let's talk about O'Gorman as well. They've won a couple games in a row now. They always play better in the second half. Without Manny Struck, had a big week with Peyton Hagee, and this is 2 weeks in a row now that Bennett Dannenbring has thrown for over 300 yards. Yes, he played 2 Rapid City teams, but I'll tell you what, it helps to get some confidence after you win a couple games like that.
Yeah, for sure. And, it was clear from the beginning of the season that, the kid can sling it and he can run too. He's a good player. I've always really liked his game. So, for him to come into his own at this late stage of the season, that's a positive thing for O'Gorman. Quarterback play might be the difference in some of those, lower-seeded matchups. So, I don't know if it's enough for them to pull off an upset. They need a couple more things to come together. But, if they're going to keep on running with these wins towards the end of the season, O'Gorman's in as good a position as any to kind of surprise.
They'll have their 3rd week in a row against a sub-500 team. This one is Huron coming in to play from a class below. So O'Gorman going to try to keep tuning up as they approach the playoffs. Washington is at Stevens. Stevens had that big win earlier in the year against Roosevelt. Have just been clutching, trying to get a good win again. They have an opportunity against Washington to reestablish themselves before the playoffs. But I'll tell you what, this is going to be tough because Stevens gives up so many big plays. And Washington, they'll need a win to bounce back after playing Roosevelt.
Yeah, and I think this will be a bounce back for Washington. Washington's a really good team, and they definitely didn't play to the best of their ability last week. And this is a perfect opportunity to get it. Obviously, traveling to Rapid City is never an easy thing. It's just a long trip, but I think Stevens hasn't really shown enough to show that they can hang with a team like Washington.
And Bryan Valley is still undefeated. They take on Central. Central without a win in 11 AAA. So I think we know how that one will end, but they got to play those game out and they got to travel. So Brandon Valley looking to stay undefeated as they enter next week's big matchup with Harrisburg. Hard not to look ahead to that. We'll talk more about that next week. It just interests me in the back of my mind, though, how much are these teams going to put into that game, or maybe seeing each other again in the playoffs? If they're both undefeated going into that last game,
Harrisburg, Brandon Valley.
Yeah.
I mean, man, like you said, we're definitely going to break down this game a ton next week. But that's I don't know. That's if they meet, they probably know they're going to meet again. Even in those the last.
Or at least have to expect that. You're right. 11 AA. T does it again. They played a pretty close first half with Aberdeen Central. I had a chance to talk with Scott Svensson, the head coach for Aberdeen Central, and they've had 4 losses in a row now after their 3-0 start. But they felt like they're back on track. Played a good game against T in the first half. They only lost by 20, which is pretty good against T. But that shows you where T's at too when they can win by 20 and maybe not be at their best.
Yeah, and this is something that is not abnormal for T. T has had slow starts in the past. They went down, I believe it was 14-0 to Watertown, or maybe it was 14-7 at some point. I don't know if they traded touchdowns in the beginning, but that was something that they talked about after that game. They want to get off to better starts. That's really the only thing that's holding them back from being a great team, at least in their perspective. I mean, I think from our perspective, we probably think they're there already. But
pretty well.
Yeah, so I mean, there's going to be a few tests for T over the course the next couple games, but that was sort of a very similar thing that they've done throughout the entire season, and the end result is still a big win for them.
And then another takeaway from last week's games, Pierre goes back-to-back weeks putting up 50 points. They did give up 40 points to Watertown, and we talked about this, as you did specifically, Michael, about Watertown being a measuring stick between Pierre and T. Pierre played a much closer game against Watertown than T did.
Yeah, and they both sort of put up the same number of points too.
Yeah.
Pierre, I think, edged them a little bit, but I would take a say 42-21 win over a 50-40 win. I mean, it definitely shows where T is at this point of the season. But then again, Watertown could have gotten better. I mean, Watertown showed a lot in that T game, at least early on, and then T just sort of shut them down. I mean, T's defense is really good, but
I feel like T had control of that Watertown game, and I felt like Pierre had control of the Watertown game. They just gave up some big plays. Cole Holden just went crazy.
Yeah, and the funny thing is I think Pierre had control of the game for a little bit longer, actually, because, it seemed like, at least in the early going, that Watertown, oh, wow, they might surprise. But then once the first quarter ended, that thought pretty much stopped.
So in the end, I mean, what does that mean with that measuring stick of Watertown? What does that mean? Who's better, Pierre or T?
I mean, you gotta pick T at this point. Unfortunately, you're never gonna have that matchup. At least until the playoffs.
I was going to say, I think we might, but I think there's some other teams that might get in the way too. I think this Brookings team is really good.
And there's a couple teams that are sort of rising up, and I'm rising up in this class too. I mean, this is going to be a really, really tough class, and Pierre, T, Brookings, those are probably the 3 that are the most likely to win a title.
But a couple teams go, one way or the other. I mean, I think Watertown you can't totally dismiss, and then Yankton's another team that's kind of lurking out there. They played right with Jefferson. They played, they lost that game early to Aberdeen Central, but I think they're in the mix here as well.
Yeah, and a couple weeks ago, Aberdeen Central, even after maybe their first loss, we were like, but they'll still maybe come around.
Yeah.
And
I think they will have a stronger finish, but yeah, they had a rough stretch.
Yeah, and because it's almost inexplicable that they've done this poorly over the past couple of games. But I think they might come into a little bit of a good stretch towards the end of the year. But I don't know. This is going to be a really, really tough class, and that T-Pierre discussion is going to be a really, really hot topic until they match up with each other.
Yeah, and we'll be looking forward to covering a lot of 11 AA craziness through the next couple weeks. This week's games, Spearfish takes on T, and that's in T because in the northern Black Hills right now, they just got a ton of snow, and that was scheduled in T anyway, but it would have been tough for Spearfish to play that game. Huron, we talked about, is at O'Gorman, tough game for them. And then we've got the two games I think that people are really looking forward to in this class. Yankton at Brookings, and then Pierre at Aberdeen. This is almost like a little pre-playoff scenario where you have two teams in the middle with Yankton and Brookings going at it. It's in Brookings. Yankton could really use a signature win. This would be a good place to start.
Yeah, and this that's probably one of the best teams, best games in the state this week. I mean, these are teams that at separate parts of the season were really rising really fast, and they've always stayed sort of close. And Brookings had their recent run, and it catapulted them to one of the top 3 teams in the class. So it'll be interesting to see where this plays out because they've sort of had up and downs throughout the year, but they've always stayed relatively steady.
Every time I talk to a coach after they play Brookings, I always hear compliments about how well coached they were and how well organized they were and how their offense really executed, their defense really executed. And I think that's going to get Brookings some ground going into the, maybe not the top end talent, but Justin Kofel has had a really good week. Last week, almost perfect throwing the ball, and Tyson Brandt has been outstanding running the ball. Their defense is airtight. I think it's going to be really tough for Yankton to knock them off, although Rugby Riken is kind of an X factor. They've got so many good receivers on Yankton. If they can get the passing game figured out, they can give Brookings some problems in that game. Pierre at Aberdeen, that's the game we have right here on Midco Sports. That is live on Friday night. I had a chance to talk to both coaches, and Steve Steele has this Pierre team rocking as far as putting 50-plus points up the last couple weeks. He thinks Aberdeen's going to be a little tougher this week in containing Sam Rolfe. Then I talked to Aberdeen, and they've had a few injury issues, and it's really showed up. He didn't want to pin the problems on injuries, but you can tell that they've been roughed up the last few weeks, and he feels like they've gotten healthy. And this would go a long way if Aberdeen can play with Pierre, let alone maybe sneak out a victory.
Yeah, and if you were confused by that Watertown game, you get another chance to see, how Pierre fares against the team that T beat pretty badly.
Yeah,
so,
it's back-to-back games against the same back.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of what happens when the class is that close, and some lucky scheduling, but still, it's it's very interesting that we kind of get those back-to-back of, all right, if you're confused by the first one, here's the second one, just to give you a little bit more of an idea.
And then we've got Mitchell with just one win on the year. I think people feel like they're a better team than a one-win team, but they just have not been able to put it all together yet. They play Watertown, who is moving in the north direction right now. Let's move on to Class 11A now. A couple takeaways from last week.
Del Rapids was a team that was sort of, a fringe top 5 team. They spent some time in the poll, and then I believe they dropped out
they get to
recently.
Number 5, I think they are landed at number 5 right now.
Okay, so yeah, so they were sort of like, they were close.
They were threatening to be a top tier team, but they kind of settled back to that next tier.
Right, and for the top team in the class to show that they're the top team in the class, I mean, that's about as much proof as you need. You go against the teams that you should beat, and you beat them really badly. So that was a big win for Madison. I mean, at this stage of the season, everything's a big win, but a lot of these teams are really sort of trying to prove that they're the best team out there, and
they're so physical. They're a very tough team, and they're led by Trey Smith, who really sets the tone for them. Vermilion might be a threat in 11A. At the beginning of the year, we weren't sure. They have a brand new head coach, Tom O'Boyle, and they are a physical team, and they have big play strike ability. McKee Sheffield has made some huge plays for them. They traded big plays in that West Central game. It wasn't high scoring, but the big plays decided it, and they won it because West Central did not convert on a 2-point conversion late in the game. And Vermilion might be a threat in this class. They've only lost to Madison and to Canton, the top 2 teams. Vermilion's right there. And then we'll talk about the actual games coming up. Tonight it starts off with Madison West Central. That's where I got from my notes. I think West Central has had a couple of nail-biter close games that they've lost, against Canton, and then last week against Vermilion. They've had a lot of close games this year. They would love to be able to play a close game with Madison.
West Central's a really, really good team. They played with some of those top teams in the class, and this is probably Madison's biggest test before the season ends. I mean, that's not very huge of a statement. We have 2 weeks left to go, but West Central's going to be a team that is a threat to some of those top teams in the playoffs. So, if West Central is to get a win tonight, I mean, that would be, or it's tonight, correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So if West Central's to get a win tonight, that would be absolutely enormous for them moving forward. But Madison can really prove, what they sort of proved last week against a little bit of a lesser opponent. That they're the top team, and that's not going to change.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a lot of fun. Friday night we've got Tri-Valley at Vermilion. Tri-Valley's one of those teams with Sioux Falls Christian and Millbank who are really trying to make sure they make the playoffs. And Tri-Valley has had some good games this year. That'll be interesting to see how they play against Vermilion. Then Canton takes on Sioux Falls Christian, another team who's just been banged up a little bit. They're just not at 100%. And Canton, another team who's without Avery Herding now. It could be a struggle for these teams to see who has the most resilience to finish strong. But Canton need a convincing win, I think, to feel like they're a title contender.
Yeah, and Sioux Falls Christian has Brooks Nelson back at quarterback now, and once they get a little bit healthier, I mean, I think that their offense looked their offense looked really good in the beginning of the season with obviously Tate Snyder at quarterback, so they with a full strength team. I mean, you have to think that the quarterback switch isn't going to make them worse. Like, they put Brooks Nelson in there because he's there. They put them in there because that's how their offense is supposed to run. So Sioux Falls Christian, I could see turning a corner a bit. Canton's a tough call when you kind of really need a turnaround at this point. But I mean, again, just Canton with Madison is sort of trying to prove that they could just
get another shot at it.
Yeah, really beat badly. Some of those teams that are kind of in that middle tier of the class. So, that'll be an interesting matchup, and it'd be interesting to see, if Sioux Falls Christian can surprise.
Yeah, there'll be a couple good ones in 11A that'll help decide. First of all, who makes the playoffs, and then the seeding is a big thing to watch in 11A. Let's move to 11B now. This week's games, we've got Woonsocket, Wessington Springs, Sanborn Central, who feel like they've turned a corner in the last couple of weeks. They play against Mount Vernon, Plankinton, two teams. I mean, these could be challengers in 11B. They're very physical teams. They love to run the football, and the winner of this one has an inside edge to probably a top 4 seed for sure, maybe even the 3 seed in 11B. This could be a fun game to watch if you're into knock them down, drag them out fights.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, right now Mount Vernon Plankinton is the higher seed at this point, but Woonsocket, Western Springs, Sanborn Central, I mean, they've been really good over the past couple of weeks, and they've sort of been one of those fast risers towards the end of the season.
They've only lost to the top 2 teams in the class too, and that was when they didn't have a full, some of their best players were not back. So Quentin Christensen back now, and Olinger running the ball. They're looking really good. Yeah, and that's how there's a ton of 5-win teams in this class, and that's how a 5-win team they're the top ranked 5-win team in the class. I mean that is inarguable. I mean they've played some really tough opponents, and they've played some of their lesser opponents really well. Right. So they're a team that probably thinks that with some better scheduling draws, maybe they're in the position of Mount Vernon Plankinton. So this is a great matchup for Mount Vernon Plankinton to kind of prove that they belong in that upper echelon, because they've been sort of like hanging outside the pole for most of the season. So Woonsocket, Western Union Springs, Sanborn Central, both of these teams, they have a ton to prove. It'll be fun to see who pulls ahead in that one. Another one to watch in 11B, the Big East Conference title. There's some conference championship games going on this week. This is the Big East, where Beresford, they knocked off Bridgewater Emory Ethan a couple weeks ago, and they're coming in at 5-2. The Watchdogs playing much better. Their defense has been more stout. They're forcing, some more 3-and-outs that they weren't doing earlier in the year. The Watchdogs feel like they're going in the right direction, but they run into Parker Pitts, maybe the biggest weapon in all of 11B.
Yeah, and we were talking about this a little bit before the show. If you look at the playoff picture right now, Beersford's sitting at the 14th seed. They need a win, and they, as you said, they're a good team, and it would, kind of be disappointing for them if they were to miss the playoffs. But right now there's just so many teams with 5 wins, and they don't necessarily rank very favorably against most of them. At least how the power points just kind of played out. So going up against Sioux Valley, I mean, this would be a statement win, but it also is kind of a necessary win for them.
Sioux Valley's been playing well, but they've put up some points in bunches. They've let teams stay close to them. They've played some good teams lately, but they would love to find a way to put Beersford in the rearview mirror and stay at that number 2 seed so they can stay at home throughout the playoffs. 9-man football. I mean, last week we had some fun ones. Hanson was tied with Canastota Freeman late in the game. They took the lead. That's the second week in a row Hanson has grinded one out to stay undefeated in 9AA. Howard went against another 9AA team in Garrettson, and some big plays at the end of that game. Jay Syfor came out of nowhere, made a big play to turn the tides, and Howard stays undefeated. Some fun stuff last week. That sets up this week's Corn Belt Conference title game between Howard and Hanson. It's not very often we get an undefeated battle this late in the season.
Yeah, and Howard is not any typical 9A team. I mean, obviously, DeSmet and Howard at the top of 9A, they might be the 2 best teams in 9-man football. And Hanson has a lot to, maybe has even more to prove this week than Howard does, just because of how much stock we've put into that 9A class. But I mean, Howard is playing for a playoff seed right now. Yeah. I mean, they're I was looking at the standings before, and as good as DeSmet and Howard have been individually, they're at the 3rd and 4th seed respectively.
Harriet, Selby area and Wall are both undefeated in 9A as well. So it's really interesting to see how this plays out. And Harriet Selby area, you look at the quality of their schedule, they've had the toughest schedule. They've had the most teams above 500, and that counts in seed points.
Yeah, and that's why they're sitting at number 1. But, I think, this is a good matchup for Howard because it's a good opportunity for them to get a really, really quality win. Obviously going up against the best team in a class above them. I mean, that's got to be worth something.
Yeah, you bet it is. And the teams are very similar. They both feature a couple of different running backs. They will pound the ball down your throat. Hanson has the ability to throw if they need to late in the game, but they've been really good this year with spreading the ball out and playing defense. And Howard, of course, same way. They've made some big plays. Jay Syfor moved to tight end this year. He's made some big plays in the passing game, but really they are a running team, and they've got a lot of different guys who like to run the football. This will be a lot of fun if you're a 9-man football fan to check out. Another game in 9-man football we got to talk about, Hitchcock-Tulare and Avon. I think Hitchcock-Tulare has been the surprise team in 9B this year. I mean, Avon has also been a surprise team staying undefeated. But this one will go a long way to see who has home field throughout the 9B playoffs. Hitchcock-Tulare, I think, has an opportunity here to establish themselves as one of the favorites in 9B.
Yeah, and Avon puts up a ton of points, but they're very vulnerable on the defensive end. So with an offense like Hitchcock-Tulare has, I mean, the quarterback Jack Boozma, like he's been playing fantastic, and there's not a lot of teams who could pass, in 9B, and Hitchcock-Tulare definitely is one of those teams. So they have an opportunity really probably to knock off which right now stands as the number 1 team in the class. But Avon, even though they're averaging, I believe, over 50 points a game, I mean, they give up, at least 30-something a game. So
they're vulnerable there. But last week, like many weeks, Brady Bierma has been the guy that they just feed. He got, I think, over 300 yards last week against Centerville, which is a team that does give up some points and some yards, but Avon's still got to feel good that they can run the ball on Hitchcock-Tulare.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's a look at this week coming up in high school football. A lot of good stuff. Just 1 week left. Next week, by the way, games are on Thursday. I haven't asked you yet, but I'm hoping we can maybe record this on Wednesday next week.
I think that's fine.
We'll talk about it. So you will have to tune in next week on Wednesday to see what we're doing. Where are you going to be at this week, Michael?
Well, tonight I'm going to be at Madison West Central. We talked about that earlier. West Central is, probably trying to get a big win, in the final 2 weeks before their regular season ends, and Madison's trying to prove that they're the top team. And then tomorrow, I'll be at Jefferson Harrisburg. Harrisburg is hosting the Cavaliers, and we
How
talked
about that Knuth versus Ashley.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe the two best quarterbacks in the state.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about how talented each of these players are, pretty much all season, just making plays, against anybody that they go up against, and it'll be really interesting to see who wins this quarterback battle. I mean, Ashley can stick with Knuth even if Harrisburg pulls away. I mean, Ashley certainly has the ability to make plays, just at any point of the game, and it'll be interesting to see just from a stats perspective how that plays out.
That would be interesting. Always great coverage from Argus Leader Media. We have a live game between Pierre and Aberdeen Central. I'm looking forward to this one because we haven't covered a lot of 11AA this year, and I'm interested to see just how good Lincoln Kienholz is. He has been unreal the last 2 weeks. Talking about the best quarterbacks in the state, Lincoln Kienholz is right there. And then Aberdeen Central has a pretty good quarterback of their own in Sam Rolfs, who's thrown for over 1,100 yards as well. So I think that'll be a really good quarterback battle if you're tuning in. Thanks again for watching Football Insiders. Remember, next week we'll see you on Wednesday.